Hi everyone, I'm Susan Mulvihill and welcome back to my garden. You know, I give a lot of presentations throughout the year on all different kinds of gardening topics, but it never fails that every time I will have someone ask me, okay, but what do you do about deer in the garden? And they are a huge problem no matter where you live in the country. Fortunately, there are all different kinds of strategies you can use. You can scare them, you can offend their keen sense of smell, and/or you can erect barriers. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Let's talk about ways to scare deer so that they stay out of your landscape. The first one might be a little bit obvious, but if you have a dog in your fenced yard, that is a great way to keep deer away because they don't want to be barked at and they don't want to be chased. So that would be the number one way to scare them. Another way to scare deer is to consider getting a motion-activated sprinkler. Now these hook up to the hose, they have a stake that they set on, and then on this end is a motion sensor. You adjust that to where you need it, and if something activates it, this thing shoots a strong jet of water in that direction. And that works great to keep deer away from areas of the landscape that they keep coming back to. Just make sure the thing that activates it isn't you. That would be a very nasty surprise. Now, fishing line is another option, and it's very inexpensive. Deer tend mostly to be nocturnal, so they're in your garden at night. And what you do is you tie one end of the monofilament or fishing line to, let's say, a tree branch, and then you go across a pathway that they tend to walk through and tie this other end to something else. And generally what you do is put it up about 28 to 30 inches from the ground level. That hits their side. They don't see it, but it totally freaks them out. So you could give this a try. If you have a plant that deer keep trying to get to eat, you could consider using a small sheet of wire and just putting it on the ground right in front of the plant, because deer do not want to step on something that feels very unstable to them. Deer have a very keen sense of smell, so take advantage of that. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of deer repellents on the market, and it's so important that you follow the label directions exactly. And if you are looking to use something on an edible crop, make sure it says on the label that you can do that, that it is safe. Now, I do have a natural repellent you can try. If you take a dozen eggs, crack them into a blender and whirl them together so they're mixed really well. Take those, add a gallon of water, and put all of that into a clean sprayer, and then apply it to the things you're trying to protect. Now, the eggs will give off a sulfur type of a smell, and deer do not like that. The big thing though is if you have a heavy rain, you need to reapply it. Another option you have is to use deodorant soap. And the smellier the soap you can find, the better, because deer do not like what this stuff smells like. Now, several years ago, we were having a problem with deer severely damaging our fruit trees because we didn't have a fence up yet. I'd heard about soap and I thought, well, I'm going to give it a try. Turns out it works great. So what I did is I took several bars of soap, I punched a hole through each one, and then I used little hangers to hang a few from each tree. And what I saw was, because there was snow on the ground at the time, the deer were walking way around the trees trying to avoid this smell. Yay! But there is one thing I want to warn you about, because it's a mistake I made many years ago. Don't use wire or fishing line to hang them from the branches, because that will eventually cut through the branches and you don't want to damage the tree. Instead, I would use something real stretchy, maybe like old nylons, just to allow it to expand a bit during the year's time. However, branches do get larger as the year goes by, and so I would replace these with new hangers that are larger in diameter every 6 or 7 months or thereabouts. Now, one last option in the smell department is to use human hair. Now, I know that sounds icky, but if you have a friend who cuts hair for a living and they're willing to save some nice clean hair in a bag for you, you can use that because deer smell that and they equate that with, oh, there's humans around in the area, so I better get out of here. All you need to do is just maybe use a couple little bags of it, hang it from some areas that they tend to go to, and they will stay away from the area. So that certainly is an option. Now, to be honest, the very best way to keep deer out of your garden is with some sort of a fence. And because my husband and I live out in the country, we knew we didn't want to use a solid fence and obscure our views. And so instead we went with wire. So we have a 47-inch tall field fence. It is attached to heavy-duty metal fence posts. And then my husband bought some 10-foot tall sticks of rebar and pounded them in at each fence post. Then we bought a 7-foot wide roll of deer fencing. This is a heavy-duty plastic mesh. It's really amazingly strong. And we cut the whole roll in half lengthwise so that we would have 3.5-foot wide strips of this deer fencing. So then we attached it to the rebar and also to the field fence. This has worked really well. The ideal height for a fence to keep deer out is generally 7 feet or taller. So we have 7.5 feet. But I have to say that if a deer was being chased by a predator, they probably would try scaling this and give it a go and hopefully get away from the predator. Now, solid fences are good in that deer cannot see what's on the other side, so they tend not to want to jump them. But again, if they're being chased by a predator, they would probably be willing to give it a try. The other thing is, don't forget to keep your gates closed, because if they look in the gate and see that it would be safe to jump over the fence, it's very common for them to then start jumping the fence. So keep an eye on that. So even though we have this nice tall fence, we still needed gates, right? So we bought 2 of these, and this opening is big enough to where a deer will feel very comfortable hopping through. So I came up with one idea, and that was to get some wooden wind chimes. And deer do not like seeing something moving and making noise as they're trying to hop on through. And so this has worked really well. But during the fall and winter, deer tend to be more stressed and more bold and very happy to jump through here and come into the garden. So let me show you what I did to resolve that problem. This might be a little tricky for you to see, but what I did was I made an insert that fits within the structure of the gate and covers the opening enough to where no deer is going to try to jump through. I took a piece of deer fencing, attached it to a metal conduit stick at the top and the bottom, and then I just interlock it within the framework of the gate. And this works great because deer do not go in. It acts as both a physical and a visual barrier. Another thing I wanted to mention regarding barriers is that before we had a deer fence, deer would come into our vegetable garden, and they did not bother anything that was growing underneath a floating row cover. And so I think it's one of those, if you can't see it, you're not going to eat it. Obviously, this would only apply to plants that do not need to be pollinated, because otherwise bees have to get to the flowers. But for me, it applied to a certain number of crops, and it worked really well as a physical barrier. In the fall, male deer, which are known as bucks, love to rub their antlers up and down tree trunks, and that will kill a tree in nothing flat. So get yourself some wire, make a cylinder to put around the tree. Just make sure it doesn't rub in any area, but that will act as a physical barrier to keep those bucks' antlers away from your tree. Now, there are certain plants that deer particularly love, and 3 of them that come right to mind are arborvitae hedges. Oh my, how they love those. Hostas and tulips. Now, I would not even have these tulips if they weren't in my backyard, which is fenced, because deer think these are candy and they would be history. Now, there's really no such thing as a guaranteed deer-resistant plant. That's because deer have not read the book on what they're supposed to like and not like. Also, sometimes young deer will take a bite or two out of something just to see if it's something they like. And if it's a hot, dry summer and the deer are especially stressed, then they're going to eat some things that will give them moisture and nourishment whether they like them or not. Now, I will put a list of some deer-resistant plants on my website, susansinthegarden.com, just to give you some ideas. But I do want you to know that what works for one person won't necessarily work for the other. I hope this video gave you some ideas of ways to deal with deer. Believe me, I've been there and I know how frustrating it is. But you can see there are a lot of different strategies you can try. If you ever have any questions, just let me know. My email is susan@susansinthegarden.com. See you next week.